American Special Forces in Manbij, Syria, near the border with Turkey, this month. Mauricio Lima for The New York Times. Moscow. 4 Russian nationals, and perhaps dozens more, were killed in fighting between pro-government forces in eastern Syria and members of the United States-led coalition fighting the Islamic State, according to Russian and Syrian officials. A Syrian military officer said that about 100 Syrian soldiers had been killed in the fighting on Feb. 7 and 8, but news about Russian casualties has dribbled out only slowly, through Russian news organizations and social media. Much about the attack and the associated casualties has been obscured in the fog of war. For reasons that remain unclear, Syrian government troops and some Russian nationals appear to have attacked a coalition position, near al-Tabia, Syria. The attack occurred in the vicinity of Deir al-Zour, a strategic, oil-rich territory that is coveted by the Syrians. Most of the fatalities were attributed to an American airstrike on enemy columns that was called in by American-backed Kurdish soldiers who believed they were under attack. At no point, an American military spokesman said, was there any chance of direct conflict between United States and Russian forces. Coalition officials were in regular communication with Russian counterparts before, during and after the thwarted, unprovoked attack, according to Col. Ryan S. Dillon, a spokesman for the American military. Russian officials assured coalition officials they would not engage coalition forces in the vicinity, the Kremlin, seeking to play down its involvement in the fighting in Syria and seemingly hoping to avoid escalating tensions with the United States, has sidestepped questions about the episode, even as it faces rare criticism at home over its failure to acknowledge the deaths of Russians in Syria. It has stressed repeatedly since last Wednesday that no members of the Russian armed forces were killed, and that any Russians fighting alongside the Syrians were mercenaries. We only handle the data that concerns Russian forces servicemen. Dmitry S. Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said at a news briefing on Tuesday. We don't have data about other Russians who could be in Syria. The Kremlin said much the same about the nature of the forces in Crimea and eastern Ukraine in 2014, however, claiming they were volunteers and men on vacation, only to admit later that they were regular soldiers. President Vladimir V. Putin has said at least 3 times since 2016 that combat operations in Syria were winding down, including once during a surprise visit to a Russian airbase in Syria last December. Yet there are hundreds if not thousands of contract soldiers in Syria whom the Russian government has never acknowledged. They were deployed both to help keep the official cost down and to avoid reports of casualties, especially with the March presidential election in Russia fast approaching. Even though the Kremlin enacted a law during the Ukraine crisis in 2015 to make battlefield casualties a secret, the funerals for regular soldiers killed in combat need to be more official than those for mercenaries, and are thus difficult to hide. And some individual Russians have begun speaking out. Alexander Ionov, a Russian businessman working in Syria offering security and other services, said he estimated after conversations with associates in several private military organizations that more than 200 Russians might have been killed. Mr. Ionov said not all those killed were Russian. Some of the paid fighters came from other countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. More than 200 is the current estimate. We cannot know the exact number yet, but most of them were Russian, he said in a telephone interview. Mr. Ionov said he was speaking out because he wanted any Russians who were killed to be officially recognized for their sacrifice. The truth has to be told, he said. If people died, then this should be recognized and respects should be paid to people who fought against terrorists. He called on the government to give a fuller version of events, adding, people are outraged because they want to know the truth. Mr. Ionov was not the only one speaking out about Russian fatalities. Alexander Averin, a member of the other Russian Nationalist Party, confirmed that Kirill Ananiev, a party member who left for Syria about a year ago, had been killed in the airstrike, noting that there were other, substantial losses. I can confirm that Kirill died on Feb. 7 in Syria, near the Euphrates River, as a result of a strike by the American coalition. Mr. Averin said in an interview, adding that he was aware of substantial losses suffered by paramilitary structures with ties to Russia. He refused to elaborate. Another victim, Vladimir N. Loganov, 51, died in an unequal fight on Feb. 7 in the area of Syria's Deir al-Zour, according to a statement published online by his paramilitary organization. He died, heroically defending our motherland in the far reaches against the invasion of maddened barbarians, the group, the Baltic Cossack Union in Kaliningrad, said in the statement. Syrian pro-government fighters, who were reportedly wounded in a United States airstrike near Deir al-Zour, at a hospital in the town. Agence France-Presse, Getty Images. In another case, Lubava Kocheva, a woman from central Russia, said in a brief online chat that 2 of her male friends in Syria, Igor Kosoturov and Stanislav Matviev, also died on Feb. 7. "We don't know anything, whether they will bring them or not," said Mrs. Kocheva, 41, referring to the men's corpses. "This is very difficult and frightening. The names of most of the victims identified so far were first reported by the Conflict Intelligence Team, a group of Russian investigative bloggers. The exact circumstances of their deaths could not be established by the New York Times." The Russian Defense Ministry, which supports the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, in the continuing civil war, said none of its servicemen had been involved in the clash and that only 25 pro-government Syrian insurgents were wounded. It took pains to distance itself from the battle. The reason for the incident was lack of coordination between the reconnaissance movements of the Syrian insurgents and the Russian Operative Command, the ministry said in its statement on Thursday. The number and exact nature of private Russian security firms operating in Syria is unclear, although there have been persistent reports in the Russian news media that some militiamen who fought on the side of the Russian-backed separatists in the war in eastern Ukraine later deployed to Syria. The main Russian paramilitary contracting organization is the Wagner Group, known by the nickname of the retired Russian officer who leads it. The group has been operating in Syria in various capacities, including protecting some oil fields, according to multiple reports in the Russian news media. Its relationship with the Kremlin is murky and unconfirmed, but its leaders have reportedly received awards in the Kremlin and its mercenaries are trained at the Russian Defense Ministry's facilities. Grigory Yavlinsky, a veteran Russian opposition politician who is a candidate in next month's presidential election, called on Tuesday for Mr. Putin to disclose the number of Russians who had died in Syria. "I demand an explanation as to why Russian nationals take part in ground military operations in Syria, despite the statements by the President and Defense Minister that Russian military formations will be withdrawn from this country," Mr. Yavlinsky said in a statement. "I also think there needs to be a public report about relations with the US, as there is a growing threat of an accidental or deliberate direct military clash between Russia and America." The official Kremlin stance is that its military deployment in Syria is now centered on 2 permanent bases, one for Russia's Air Force and one for its Navy, thereby invitation from the Syrian government. Russian political analysts said that the country's reluctance to confirm that its citizens had died as a result of a United States-led airstrike was actually a sign that Moscow did not want to further worsen the already fractured bilateral relations with Washington. "This is a very rare case, where the positions of Russia and the US got closer," said Alexei V. Makarkin, an analyst at the Center for Political Technologies, a think tank in Moscow. "No one wants to take steps that will do irreparable damage to the already broken Russia-US relations." Correction, February 13, 2018. Because of an editing error, an earlier version of this article incorrectly described an account by a Syrian military officer. He said that about 100 Syrian, not Russian, soldiers died in fighting on Feb. 7 and 8. Ivan Nichepurenko and Neil McFark reported from Moscow, and Thomas Gibbons-Neff from Washington. Oleg Matsnev contributed reporting from Moscow. A version of this article appears in print on February 14, 2018, on page A4 of the New York edition with the headline "Dozens of Russians may have perished in Syrian battle."